And we come tonight to Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 10 to 23. I'll read this quickly, though may I mention again that if you can read the passage before you come, I think that you may find you gain a lot more from the Bible study, especially if you have your own thoughts and have done some study maybe yourselves before you're able to come on Thursday evenings. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 10. But Judah said, this is while they're building the walls, and there's a certain amount of opposition, you remember, and there are troubles beginning to arise. But Judah said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing, and there's much rubbish. We're not able to work on the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come into the midst of them and kill them and stop the work. When the Jews who lived by them came, they said to us 10 times, from all the places where they live, they'll come up against us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. When our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind all the house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were laden in such a way that each with one hand labored on the work, and with the other held his weapon. And each of the builders had his sword girded at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn till the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, that every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by day and may labor by night. So neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes, each kept his weapon in his hand. Now here we have a very interesting and instructive passage on, I think, one of the most common and powerful attacks of Satan, which every one of us knows only too well, and that is discouragement. Maybe you pray and pray and pray for a friend of yours or even a member of your family to come and put their trust in Jesus. You invite them to services, maybe they come, maybe they don't come. If they do come, maybe they just find nothing that's relevant or helpful and no impact seems to be made at all, and you feel discouraged. Or perhaps you work and work at the annex and spend many hours there getting increasingly tired and very much aware there's much rubbish. And although there is a tremendous amount of work to be done, still you are aware that there's a lot, work has been done, still you are aware that a lot is still to be done. Or maybe you battle with a personal problem. You have often depression or you have some illness. And you fight about this, you pray against it, and yet year after year after year, it still seems to be there, nagging away at you. Maybe one or two of you have spent many, many hours in the catacombs talking to some of the young people there, and you've prayed for them a lot, and you've talked to them, and you've tried to show them the way to Jesus, and still yet after this time that the catacombs have been open 2 years or more rather than that, still there's not much in the way of lasting fruit demonstrating the power of God. I'm sure there is fruit, but it's sometimes discouraging. We had a tape from Ross, which we listened part of it yesterday, and we shall play a bit of it at the fellowship next Thursday. And he said there that as he's doing 1.5 times the amount of work that they're expected to do at the language school, he finds that almost at this stage he's sort of semi-dreading each day as it starts. Because it is just sheer hard work. He's learned so far about 1,700 Chinese characters, which is quite a thing. But that is only one half what he needs to learn as the very basic amount before he can start really to communicate properly. He needs 3,500 Chinese characters to learn off by heart before he can really communicate. And you can imagine him getting discouraged at this time, 10 hours a day, day after day after day after day, and a lot of other things not being too easy as well from time to time. And Ross in his tape reminded us of a quotation from Watchman Nee, which I've sometimes quoted before. His quote in the tape wasn't exactly the same as this, but it's exactly the same thought. And that is that Watchman Nee takes up the line that it's wrong to assume that the real Christian and the New Testament Christian is someone who's always gloriously on top with a smile from ear to ear and always sort of happy and victorious and triumphant, never a problem, never a frown, never a note of discouragement. Watchman Nee, in one of his books, What Shall This Man Do?, says this: I once thought a true Christian should smile from morning to night. If at any time he shed a tear, he ceased to be victorious. One day I read 2 Corinthians and came to the passage where Paul said he was sad. As sorrowful, I read. Now I was arrested. Paul, sorrowful, I thought. And then I read that he shed many tears. And I wondered, can it actually be that Paul wept? I read that he was perplexed. And I thought, was Paul really perplexed? And I read this: we were weighed down exceedingly beyond our power, so that we despaired even of life. And I asked myself, amazed, is it possible that this Paul was even despaired? In fact, Watchman Nee goes on to say, I discovered that Paul was a man, and the very sort of man I knew. I think it's very helpful that to realize that the very greatest Christians one can read about, Paul and some of the very great Christians down the history of the church, have been people who have known fears, who have known discouragement, who have known times when they've despaired, been depressed, been perplexed, been saddened, have wept, and many, many times when they haven't been smiling from morning to night. And we need to remember this. And I think we need to stress, and Ross mentioned this, I think this is one of the lessons that Lord was teaching him and is teaching him at the moment when all this terrific pressure is on him, that the true picture of the normal Christian life is not the constant radiant Christian who always seems to be wonderfully on top and maybe depressingly so because others aren't. But someone who may be desperately conscious of their weakness and yet knows the power of Christ in that weakness. I read, I think, in a magazine only the other day that Catherine Kuhlman, who has this fantastic ministry, particularly of healing in America, but also of evangelism, and who regularly, weekly, speaks to crowds of 8,000, and has done so for a very long time, still, when she comes, as it were, onto the stage, to the place where she speaks, in this vast place, she dies 1,000 deaths before she gets there. She's so nervous. Here's someone who's had fantastic ministry for many, many years, and yet she's still desperately nervous and despairs at times because of her weakness that she feels. The real Christian picture is much weakness that is felt, but the power of Christ in that weakness. And Ross mentioned, I think I've heard this once before, but it's a lovely quotation from Smith Wigglesworth, a great Yorkshire Christian. The Lord has to drive over you 1,000 times with a steamroller before he can use you. And so some of you have been driven over 700 times. You've still got a long way to go yet before eventually the Lord can use you. Remember, the Lord is very near to those who are broken in heart. They're broken-hearted, and those who are crushed in spirit. The Lord is very, very near. And it's often, I think many of us have been conscious of this perhaps at different times, but I can think of many times where I have been desperately conscious of personal weakness, when, in an amazing way, the Lord seems to have used one's words or whatever it may have been to be a blessing to others. And that is the picture of the Christian life. We may often feel down, but if our hearts, at any rate, are looking up to the Lord in the midst of our discouragement, the Lord can still bless us powerfully. Now let's see why Nehemiah and his friends were discouraged, perhaps especially his friends, because Nehemiah was trying to help them, but no doubt in his own heart he was discouraged too. 3 main things here. First of all, the size of their task. Verse 10 again. I want to spend a bit of time on this. Judah said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. There's much rubbish. We're not able to work on the wall. Do you notice those are entirely negative thoughts? Strength failing, much rubbish, not able. And in fact, if we let negative thoughts sort of continue in our mind, and we speak them out, these negative thoughts will always snap the strength that we already have. That is, the power, if you like, of negative thoughts. If you go on saying about something that maybe you've been asked to do, I'm not able, I'm not able, I'm not able, then sooner or later you really will not be able to do it. That is the power of negative thinking. There's a lovely article in this month, or one of the recent evidences. I don't know whether people get the evidence, but it's the magazine of World Outreach. It's up there, and anyone can get it if they'd like to ask for it. See me or Anne or someone, and we'll get you on the mailing list for it. There's some lovely articles in this evidence which comes out speaking about some of the Lord's work in the Far East, and we support this financially, at any rate, from St. Cuthbert's. And there's one article on Switch On to Neutral, God's Tranquilizer. And what it's really saying here is that very often we, as it were, drive our bodies and our minds, in first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, whatever it may be, or even in reverse sometimes. But what we need to be often is in neutral, where we're just freewheeling, where we're just cruising, where we aren't driving forward or acting as a brake, driving backwards. And he says there are times where we need very consciously to switch into neutral, to maintain a position of mental rest. He gives an illustration. Recently in Hong Kong, says Len Jones, the author of this, I had a heavy parcel to take to the, post office. As I walked, I thought how heavy it was and how far I had to walk. Yes, that was bad enough, but why, in addition to all that, be under strain as well, for that can do more harm than either the weight or the distance. In other words, it wasn't the weight or the distance which would really be harmful to him, but it was a strain of worrying about it that would be more harmful. And he said, so I said to myself, don't be under strain. Thinking and planning a lot, or even worrying about the weight and distance, will not help. So I threw my engine into neutral, and I was simply amazed how easy it made the job in hand. And there he says that the real burden is not so much the job that you've got to do, but all the anxiety which goes with it. And if we can learn to slip, as it were, this engine into neutral, then we won't have this strain. Well, this is a question of just bringing these negative thoughts to Jesus Christ, perhaps, to bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, as Paul puts it. You see, they were here filled with negative thoughts, but in fact they should have been terrifically encouraged. If you look back at verse 6, it says there, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Wonderful amount had been achieved, but instead of experiencing the power of praise and thanking God for all that had happened, they were knowing rather the cancer of criticism and complaining and so on. Negative thoughts eat their way into our system. There's that lovely children's chorus, which is tremendously simple, but has a very profound truth in it. Count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. The devil has a counterfeit one of that chorus. It says, count your problems, name them one by one, and it will dismay you what is still not done. And very often you're at the beginning of the day, you think all the things you haven't done, all the things you ought to do, and you're counting your problems, and then you really are discouraged or weighed down by these negative thoughts. And some Christians occasionally can have a devastating ministry of discouragement, because they can be in a church or in a fellowship criticizing, complaining, grumbling, whatever it may be, and there are a few more powerful ways in which the devil can use a person than this discouragement. Others have a wonderful ministry of encouragement. Many, many times when I've maybe gone through personal battles of one form or another, I've been terrifically helped by Christians, whoever they may be, who have tried to exercise a ministry of encouragement. And I would say that if you want to be a blessing in this fellowship or in any church to which you belong, you don't have to have special gifts of speaking or organizing or something like that. If you want to be of real blessing and priceless value in that fellowship, covet the ministry of encouragement. Maybe to one other person or to the fellowship as a whole or to some individual, covet, pray for, specifically ask for this ministry of encouragement. Those who have a ministry of encouragement, who can lift our hearts up and see Christians through battles and try to understand some of the problems and so on and see them through it, are absolutely worth their weight in gold. A person who has such a ministry like that may not be blind to faults and failings, and in love it may be necessary to say something along these lines from time to time. But remember that love bears all things, which means that it throws a cloak of silence over what is displeasing in someone else. And remember that love will always, especially if it sees a person in need, will commit that person in prayer to God and will pray for that person. And all real prayer should be with thanksgiving. Don't be anxious for anything, says Paul, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And it's wonderful how Paul, who sometimes had to rebuke Christians in his letters, always, I think almost without fail, began by encouraging them that corrupt and carnal fellowship at Corinth. He praised God for the wonderful things that God was doing in their midst. This is terrific. God has blessed you in every wonderful way, and I thank God for it. But in fact, there are some quite serious things wrong in your fellowship and so on. But always trying to maintain this encouragement. Do remember this, because in Christian fellowship, every now and then I hear this, and perhaps just recently again one's heard it a little bit. A little bit of conflict, a little bit of misunderstanding, a little bit of criticism between one person and another person and so on. Well, however hard we try, we are sinners, we are unprofitable servants. No one is perfect. Any fool can criticize, but a real Christian needs to encourage. Build one another up in the Lord. So here then were negative thoughts because of the size of their task. And incidentally, if you are working at the annex, or will be so in the next few days, don't think, please, there's 101 things still to be done, but think of the 1,001 things which have been done, and praise God for that. Because I was down there just before the fellowship this evening, and absolutely thrilled with the work that is being done there. And if you go down and you just don't, for the moment, happen to like the colour scheme or the lights or something like that, don't go down there and say, oh, what an awful colour scheme, or I wouldn't have chosen that, or I would have chosen different lights. But realize there's been terrific work done, and encourage. Some people are desperately tired because they're given night after night after night after night. 2 people were working till 1:45 the other night, trying to get a job completed. There's been an immense amount of sacrificial work done down there. And if those of us have not been so involved, come down and just sort of make a passing comment without encouraging, this could be devastating to those who've practically drawn blood on the place. But discouragement can come because of the size of the task, and in Christian work there are many big tasks that we're faced with. Secondly, they were discouraged because of the threat of their opponents, verse 11. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come into the midst of them and kill them and stop the work. And remember, this threat came shortly after the scorn in verses 2 and 3, which no doubt you studied last Thursday. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore things? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burn ones at that? And so on. But now this threat, we're going to come and kill you and stop the work. And I think in Christian work of one form or another, a familiar attack, very familiar, of Satan is that of fear. What will my friends say if I really start to witness boldly to Jesus? What about those at work? What about my family? I know a number of people in this fellowship are going through very difficult times because members of your family or friends that you would like to remain in good friendship with are in fact critical of your Christian faith, and you find it discouraging. We're praying for tonight one nurse called Lorraine. I've given the story briefly before, but Lorraine was converted to Christ last year, was very much attacked by some of her colleagues, and got very discouraged by this, and felt very much sort of tossed to and fro. Her conscience told her what was right, but all her friends were telling her what she ought to do and not to get stupid and fanatical and all the rest of it. And in this matter of real tension, and no doubt with other problems as well, I don't know the full story, she ended up with, in fact, a small breakdown and has been in Nehemiah for a bit. She's out of Nehemiah now, but has completely dropped the Christian faith because she can't take the strain. That's why we're going to pray for her. But I would say, because this is by no means an isolated case, we need to expect in the coming days in this country more and more direct opposition. She had opposition not only from some of the nurses, but from some of the psychiatrists who warned her not to have anything to do with certain Christians who had been helping her. And we've got to face up to the fact that, especially some of us who are parents, that some of the teachers in our schools will be humanist teachers, anti-Christian teachers. Many of the lecturers in universities and colleges are humanist lecturers. Many of the psychiatrists today are humanist psychiatrists, anti-Christian. Not just unbelievers, but against Christian things. And I've had in the last, I suppose, 2 or 3 weeks about 4 cases that I've either known personally or heard of where there has been a real attack from psychiatrists against people who happen to be professing Christians. Well, we shouldn't be surprised at this because there are many growing humanists who feel Christianity is a drag on society, it's a drag on people's lives, and they want to push it away. And we should expect increasing opposition. One man that I'm looking forward to seeing again, a person I've known 3 years ago, who's coming up to join us in York and join with our fellowship here in the autumn, is a man called Ken Hedges. He's a captain in the army, a doctor, a medical doctor, and he's stationed up here in the autumn, and he's going to join our fellowship. He's a fine Christian. He happened to be one of the team that crossed the North Pole, you may remember, last year, and he had this fantastic trek which took 476 days walking across the North Pole, which takes some doing. And he was one of the team that did this. And I had a letter only the other day from a person, a mutual friend, who said that on this party he was with 3 atheists, one a militant atheist. They forced him to go outside the tent, often into a blizzard, 40 degrees below zero, in order that he should read his Bible and pray. And there he had to kneel in the snow, outside, in the blizzard, with the only comfort being the huskies that he huddled amongst in order to get warm enough to spend his time with the Lord each day. Well, now that is the kind of opposition which people are getting today, even in sort of ordinary, nice, civilized Western circles. Don't be surprised if you're threatened in some way by an opponent of Christ. Threats of their opponents. The third thing which discouraged them was the pessimism of their friends, verse 12. When the Jews who lived by them came, they said to us 10 times, from all the places where they live, they'll come up against us. That was exaggeration anyway, but you tell anyone an exaggeration 10 times, and they'll certainly believe you. You go out and tell somebody, sorry, do you want? Close the window, please do, yes, if it's a draft coming out. If you go out and tell somebody in the street 10 times that the Minster will fall down tomorrow, you'll probably find the whole police alerted and half the people in York evacuated or something like that. You tell anyone something 10 times and they'll really believe you. But it's extraordinary again how pessimism, maybe of friends, can be very, very discouraging indeed. A woman I know living up Stockton Laneway, this is a few years ago, had broken her arm and was sitting in a bus with this arm in a plaster. And a woman sat next to her and said, "Broken your arm?" She said, "Yes." Then my husband broke his arm. Had to be reset 3 times. Then he caught pneumonia. And then he died. And this is the kind of lovely sort of pessimism which you have to sort of face from time to time. And she really felt so utterly depressed and discouraged by the end of it all. But it's extraordinary how, you can get this pessimism or fear. It's really faith in what you don't want to happen. It's desperately negative. As Job once said, the thing that I greatly feared has come upon me. So there are those 3 points of discouragement or reasons for it: the size of the task, the threats of their opponents, the pessimism of their friends. However, let's go on positively, look at Nehemiah's answer to this growing discouragement. And there was an immediate answer which he put into effect straight away, and then he thought in longer terms and made a very sensible plan. Immediately, first of all, he took their anxieties and fears seriously. We shall see this, in fact, in verse 13 as we read it in a moment. But let me just say this. You see, he had to take their anxieties and fears seriously. There might have been some truth in them. There might have been the real danger from the enemy coming up to attack them and to destroy them. And anyway, it's no help to someone who is anxious and worried about something, going up to them and say, "Snap out of it, don't be silly, don't be stupid." Because most of us have fears and anxieties and so on for all sorts of complicated reasons. And what we especially need, even if our thoughts are negative, even if they're not the best thoughts to have, we do need love, and we do need understanding, we do need help, we do need encouragement. And so he doesn't say, "Don't be stupid," that's all sort of negative stuff. But he said, "All right, yes, I see that you are anxious, let's do something practical about it." And he took practical action, therefore, in verse 13. He said, "In the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows." And halfway through verse 14, "Fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." And here you see he did something very sensible. He made sure that they were on guard by the wall near their own immediate family, with the greatest incentive to keep alert. There he put them on guard like this. And so he took their fears seriously, as we ought to whenever we meet with somebody who is discouraged and criticizing and grumbling and complaining. Don't just sweep it on one side, take it seriously. There may be something in it, and anyway they need help. And the second thing was that he pointed them to the Lord. In verse 14, I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and terrible. The Lord will work for him. I was struck just the other day when in Gillingham we had to, one evening, had a theme called Facing Fears. And I was struck again by the relevance of that Psalm 27. When David there was in a hopeless situation, his enemies surrounding him on every side. There was no possibility, if you like, humanly speaking, of being safe. But he just looked up to the Lord and said, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And he just put his trust in the Lord, who would somehow lift his head above the enemies and somehow establish him and keep him safe. And the only thing that he was concerned about there and then was that he should, seek the Lord and be in his presence and dwell in his presence continually, and to wait upon the Lord and to be of good courage, because the Lord would strengthen him and help him. Well, this is what Nehemiah does here. He says, all right, we'll take practical action, but especially remember the Lord. He will be the one who will look after us. He will not let us down at this stage, whatever the situation may be like. And the result in verse 15 was that the Lord frustrated their plan, the enemy's plan. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. That was the immediate answer then. Practical action quickly, understanding their fears, and remember the Lord. A more long-term answer, which is important for our fellowship, is that he developed a very wise principle that half the people should work on the walls, half the people should be on guard. Verse 16 following. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind all the house of Judah who were building on the wall, to give them encouragement, of course. Now, I think it's a very important principle. Let me spiritualize it a bit. Within this congregation, if you like, put it something like this, a half, roughly, ought to be engaged in very active Christian work. Some of it may be practical, working at the annex or whatever it is. Some of it may be more directly spiritual, preaching, talking to people, visiting, going around visiting elderly people, whatever it may be. But not everyone can do that, for all sorts of reasons. And therefore, if half are rarely engaged on this work of spiritual construction, the other half should be on guard and very prayerful, and backing the work up in prayer. Both are of vast importance. One of the things that impressed us terrifically about the setup at Gillingham, and we can say a bit more about that later, because it was a wonderful, the most powerful mission I've ever been on, a wonderful time, was that we were all enormously impressed by not only the volume of prayer, but the power of prayer. There was terrific prayer going on and on and on. I'm not trying to say that those who were very actively engaged in getting the meetings organized and so on were not praying. Far from it. They were praying too. They were engaged very much in prayer, as we ought to be. Here you see in verse 17, those who carried burdens were laden in such a way that each with one hand labored on the work, and with the other hand held his weapon. And each of the builders had his sword girded at his side while he built. It wasn't just sort of either or. They were doing both hands, if you like. But there were some who were not actually engaged in the active work, and who were very, very, very much on guard, or very, very much praying, as the analogy is. And we saw in Gillingham that while there were those who were active on the work, were very prayerful indeed, there were other individuals who spent very much time behind the scenes praying and praying and praying and praying, who couldn't be actively involved for all sorts of reasons, but could be praying. And I know there are folk here the same. Dear Mrs. Smith again, who's in bed all the time at the moment, spends much of her day and much of the night apparently praying for us. And many a revival has started because of some individuals, maybe older folk, who for one reason or another can't be active, have given themselves to much patient, persistent praying. I know my own personal testimony is that sometimes I'm very, very rushed indeed when it comes to preparing talks and sermons and so on. And sometimes, because of all sorts of things happening, I have more or less to rush to the evening service or to Bible study like this without being able to pray right through what I prepared in the way that I would love to do so. And I'm deeply conscious at times of not having the time of prayer that I would long to have. And often when I'm kneeling before preaching, I say, Lord, you know how prayerless it has been. Please forgive me. Same time, some of those occasions have been times of power and blessing. Now, why is it? Not because I pray, because I haven't, or very little. But because I believe there are many people in the congregation who are engaged in this absolutely vital work. And if any of you feel, I know one or two of you have said this to me from time to time, well, there's so little I feel I can do at St. Cuthbert's, or so little I can do at whatever church I'm at. I would answer, well, in fact, you can do the most vital work you could ever do, or anyone can ever do. And that is prayer, and much prayer, and going on praying. That, of course, is one reason why we issue these prayer bulletins, because I know that a number of people are very active indeed, but maybe some of you are not so active, and it would be absolutely wonderful if you could take these prayer bulletins and go through them and spend time each day really bringing the needs before the Lord and praising God for various things and praying for others that you know about. Be specific in prayer. Pray for individuals you've heard about. And I am quite certain that eventually in heaven, when the books are opened, and the question maybe is, why has there been blessing at St. Cuthbert's or wherever it is, it will not because of preaching and activity and visiting and so on, but because of the secret prayer behind the closed door, praying to the Father in secret. That will be the cause of the blessing, humanly speaking. And you could not have a more powerful ministry to exercise in this church, and I speak especially of those who are not able to get out a great deal, if you will give yourselves to prayer. That is the most precious thing you could ever do in this fellowship. I would rather have 100 people really praying than 100 people going out every week visiting, every day visiting. Where there are 100 people rarely praying, we shall see things happening. However bad personal work, preaching, whatever it may be, then there'll be power, because God's Spirit will be at work. Notice here that they had, even in these days, the equivalent of a telephone prayer link. In the end of verse 18, the man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. There's a telephone prayer link. And I hope very much that if you have a personal need or something which has cropped up, don't hesitate to ask for prayer. If you don't know about the telephone prayer link, it's just that a number of people have expressed their willingness to be involved in prayer for special urgent needs as they arise. Contact me or the Andersons or someone, and we'll begin the link. But it's so important that if you're going through battles, that you ask for prayer and rally prayer support. Our God will fight for us, but we've got to give him a chance to do it. And if we don't let the need known, if we don't tell other people about our needs, if we don't rally prayer support, we may wonder why God's let us down, but because, of course, we've never given him a chance. And it's interesting, you see here the tremendous balance that he puts forward. In the end of verse 14, he says, in effect, you fight for your brethren, etc. The end of verse 20, our God will fight for us. It's neither just up to us, nor is it just that we sit back and leave it to God. We must do a lot of fighting, but trusting that ultimately the victory belongs entirely to the Lord. Two final points as we close, very briefly. First, they were constantly on guard and constantly together, verses 21 to 23. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn till the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, that every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, keep together, so they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brethren nor my servants nor the men of the guard who follow me, none of us took off our clothes, each kept his weapon in his hand. Always on guard, always together. So important. Watch and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. For example, if you don't lock your house, or you don't lock your car, or whatever it may be, you are inviting trouble. when I went down with taking Anne and Fiona and Guy down south when I was going on to Gillingham and leaving them with my mother at Eastbourne, we stopped at one of the cafes on the motorway, and you know what a paraphernalia it is to get the small children out with all the sort of cups they've got to drink out of and umpteen things like this. And it's quite a business, really. And I thought I'd carefully locked every single door. We went off and we had a cup of coffee and orangeade and all the rest of it. And I came back, and I couldn't find my keys anywhere at all, you know, in my pocket. Oh, dear, where have I put them? Where have I dropped them? And I just happened to try my door, the driver's door, and it was open, unlocked, and there sitting in the ignition were my keys. I couldn't believe it. There were all the cases, all the sort of goods, as it were, for anyone to drive away just like that. We've been sitting there for half an hour. No one, I'm afraid, took it. Well, now, I thought, well, I didn't deserve that one, but anyway, I got away with it. But I think sometimes Christians can be almost like that. Instead of making quite sure that we're guarded against Satan, we almost give him the ignition keys and say, now, you know, well, take a chance if you want to. We just allow him to get away with it, practically. And if we don't come together in fellowship with other Christians, if we don't spend time reading our Bibles and nourishing our faith with the Word of God, if we don't do these kind of vital things, if we don't put on the armor, then in a sense we're asking for trouble. So Nehemiah said, make sure we stay together and make sure we're on guard all the time, and then we can be sure of the Lord's victory in this battle. So we may get discouraged, but that is the great answer to discouragement. Some may be very active, but make sure there are some who will be very watchful in prayer constantly. And then we shall see the Lord working with real power in our midst.